Emperor Nerva's story begins not in the battlefield or in the passionate struggles of succession that defined so many of Rome's rulers, but rather in the quiet corridors of political life, where patience, moderation, and a careful eye for survival carried him forward. Unlike the larger-than-life figures such as Julius Caesar Augustus or Nero Nerva, was a man who spent much of his life in the background of Roman politics, serving under different emperors, surviving purges, and living through the turbulent transitions of power that brought both glory and bloodshed to the empire. His reign was short, lasting only from 96 to 98 CE, but his role as the founder of the so-called Five Good Emperors dynasty made his place in Roman history significant. To understand Nerva's importance, however, one must trace his life before he assumed the throne, for his rise was not the result of ambition and military conquest, but of circumstance, wisdom, and a lifetime of loyalty to the state. Nerva was born in the year 30 CE in the small town of Narni in central Italy. His full name was Marcus Cocceius Nerva, and he came from a well-established family of the Italian aristocracy. Though not from the most ancient patrician lines like the Iuli or Claudi, his family nonetheless had a respected history in Roman public life. His ancestors included consuls and jurists, and his lineage gave him access to the senatorial class without placing him in the spotlight of dangerous politics. This middle ground origin was, in some ways, the perfect foundation for the life he would lead, one of service, discretion, and patience. Nerva's early years are not well documented, but given his background, it is likely he received the traditional education of a Roman elite training in rhetoric, philosophy, and law. Such an education prepared him not for military glory, but for public office and administrative work. And indeed, this would become his strength. As a young man, Nerva entered public life during the reign of Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE. Claudius was known for his reliance on bureaucrats and freedmen, which made the careers of many senators uncertain. Yet Nerva managed to secure positions without drawing attention to himself. This discretion would serve him well under the next emperor, Nero. Under Nero, many senators and aristocrats fell victim to the emperor's paranoia and cruelty, especially during the later years of his reign. Yet Nerva not only survived, but even prospered quietly. This was due in part to his talent as a lawyer and advisor, but also his reputation for loyalty. Nero valued those who could serve efficiently without appearing threatening, and Nerva fit this mold perfectly. He was honored with consulships and even received statues for his service, showing that he had earned the emperor's trust while avoiding the fatal spotlight that consumed so many others. When Nero's rule collapsed in 68 CE and Rome was thrown into chaos during the Year of the Four Emperors, Nerva once again proved his ability to survive transitions. The empire passed through Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, who restored stability and founded the Flavian dynasty. Nerva adapted to each change with caution, never resisting the new rulers, but offering his service to the new order. This flexibility kept him safe, while his loyalty and administrative skills kept him valuable. During Vespasian's reign, Nerva continued to rise. Vespasian's rule was marked by pragmatism and rebuilding, and Nerva's reputation for wisdom and reliability aligned well with the emperor's needs. He was rewarded with important positions and further trust from the imperial family. As the Flavian dynasty passed from Vespasian to Titus in 79 CE, and later to Domitian in 81 CE, Nerva remained a respected figure in the Senate. By now, he was older and experienced, known for his cautious yet firm approach to governance. While Domitian's reign descended into authoritarian paranoia, with senators and officials living in constant fear of execution or exile, Nerva managed once again to survive. Some historians suggest that Nerva deliberately maintained a low profile, avoiding entanglement in plots while ensuring he was not viewed as an enemy of the emperor. Others argue that Domitian may have even trusted Nerva as a loyal servant, given his long record of service under multiple emperors. Either way, Nerva endured the dangerous climate of Domitian's later years, while many others perished. It was the assassination of Domitian in 96 CE that changed Nerva's life forever. By then, Nerva was 66 years old, an advanced age for the time. When the conspirators struck Domitian down, the empire was once again on the brink of instability. The Senate needed someone to step into the role of emperor, someone who could calm the turmoil, reassure the aristocracy, and prevent chaos in the provinces. Yet the challenge was that Rome had just overthrown an authoritarian ruler. Installing a powerful general or ambitious senator might risk civil war. The conspirators and senators therefore turned to Nerva, a man who had lived his entire career in loyalty, moderation, and discretion. He had no powerful army of his own, no history of rebellion, and no threatening ambition. But he did have respect, wisdom, and the trust of the Senate. In that moment of crisis, Nerva was proclaimed emperor. His accession was unusual in Roman history, for it was one of the few times that the Senate played a decisive role in appointing the emperor rather than the military. This fact itself defined Nerva's reign. He was seen as the Senate's choice, a ruler of compromise, tasked with stabilizing the empire after Domitian's autocracy. When Nerva took the purple, he faced both relief and suspicion. The senators, who had feared Domitian's cruelty, welcomed Nerva's more moderate leadership. But the army, especially the Praetorian Guard, was deeply loyal to Domitian and viewed Nerva's rise as a betrayal. This tension between senatorial approval and military distrust would be the defining challenge of his reign. Nerva began his rule by distancing himself from Domitian's legacy. He issued a general amnesty, recalling exiles and stopping treason trials. This act earned him immense goodwill among the senatorial class, who had suffered under Domitian's authoritarian measures. He also vowed never to execute a senator, a pledge that directly opposed Domitian's brutal practices. In addition, Nerva allowed more open criticism of the emperor, signaling a shift toward a less oppressive environment. These measures endeared him to the aristocracy and intellectuals, but they also weakened his authority in the eyes of the military, who preferred a strong, commanding leader. In economic matters, Nerva sought to stabilize the finances of the empire. Domitian had left the treasury strained from his grand building projects and extravagant expenditures. Nerva, in contrast, adopted a more frugal approach. He implemented land reforms, distributing land to the poor, and introduced welfare measures such as support for children of impoverished families. These policies were popular among the people, but they also strained the already limited resources of the state. Nerva was generous in his attempts to win favor, but his generosity came at a cost, and balancing the finances proved difficult. Nonetheless, his concern for the common people gave him a reputation as a caring and moderate ruler. One of the biggest tests of Nerva's reign came from the military. The Praetorian Guard, outraged by Domitian's assassination and angry that his killers had not been punished, grew restless under Nerva. In a dramatic confrontation in late 97 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard stormed the imperial palace, took Nerva hostage, and forced him to swear that he would punish Domitian's assassins. They even humiliated him by compelling him to watch as two of the emperor's closest advisors were killed before his eyes. This episode revealed just how fragile Nerva's position was. Though he had the support of the Senate, without the loyalty of the military, his reign could collapse at any moment. Nerva's authority had been badly shaken, and he knew he needed a solution to secure the future of the empire. That solution came through adoption. Realizing that his lack of military strength was his greatest weakness, Nerva made a bold and historic decision. He adopted a younger, stronger, and more popular general as his son and heir. The man he chose was Marcus Ulpius Traianus, better known as Trajan, a highly respected military commander who was stationed along the Rhine frontier. Trajan's reputation as a capable general made him beloved by the army, and his adoption by Nerva instantly restored confidence in the stability of the empire. This decision was perhaps Nerva's most important act, for it established the precedent of adopting capable successors rather than relying solely on family bloodlines. This policy of adoptive succession would usher in the golden age of the 5 good emperors. By adopting Trajan, Nerva not only secured peace with the military, but also ensured that Rome's next ruler would be one of strength and vision. Though Nerva himself was aging and frail, he had succeeded in stabilizing the empire after Domitian's turbulent rule, bridging the gap between tyranny and the more prosperous era to come. In January of 98 CE, Nerva fell ill and died after only 16 months as emperor. His reign had been short, but his legacy was profound. He was deified by the Senate, honored for his wisdom and moderation, and remembered as the man who restored balance to Rome in a moment of great danger. His adoption of Trajan set a precedent that allowed Rome to enter a century of relative peace and prosperity under some of its greatest emperors. In reflecting on Nerva's life, it becomes clear that his importance lies not in conquests or dramatic reforms, but in his ability to serve as a bridge. He was the quiet survivor who became emperor at the twilight of his life, not by ambition, but by necessity. He ruled with moderation, restoring dignity to the Senate and easing the fears of Rome's citizens, while his greatest decision, the adoption of Trajan, ensured the future strength of the empire. His story demonstrates that sometimes the most significant leaders are not those who seek power, but those who accept it reluctantly, guided by wisdom and the demands of the moment. Nerva's legacy as the founder of the adoptive principle of succession remains one of Rome's most enduring contributions to governance, and his short reign marked the beginning of an era that many historians consider Rome's golden age. Nerva's reign, though brief, was a pivotal turning point in Roman history, and to understand the second phase of his leadership, we must look at how he consolidated power after the initial shockwaves of his sudden ascension in 96 CE, following the assassination of Domitian, a period that tested his wisdom, political skills, and ability to balance the fragile dynamics of Senate, military, and the Roman people, all of whom had different expectations of him. After calming the Senate with gestures of conciliation and reaffirming their dignity, Nerva still faced the immense challenge of earning the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard and the legions scattered across the empire, many of whom had been loyal to Domitian and resented the Senate-backed coup that brought an elderly man with no military background to the throne. And it is within this context that the second year of his reign unfolded, characterized by attempts to solidify alliances, restore fiscal order, and navigate a deeply divided political atmosphere where his legitimacy was always questioned. Nerva's government became a balancing act between reform and appeasement, as he introduced measures to alleviate economic distress, such as remitting certain taxes, distributing land to the poor, and instituting loan programs that provided farmers with low-interest credit, policies that won him popular acclaim, but also drew criticism from elites who felt the treasury was being stretched too thin. Yet Nerva understood that popularity among the urban plebs and rural provincials was essential to stabilize his shaky position. For Rome's emperors could not govern on Senate approval alone. They needed the hearts of the people and the support of the legions. During this period, Nerva also attempted to reassert Rome's moral and cultural traditions by reviving aspects of earlier Augustan ideals, including respect for the rule of law, moderation in public life, and a return to the principle that the emperor was first among citizens rather than a divine monarch, a deliberate contrast to Domitian's autocratic style. And this posture earned Nerva admiration among intellectual circles, historians, and even Stoic philosophers who had long been alienated under Domitian's paranoia. But even as Nerva carefully cultivated this image of justice and restraint, cracks in his authority became visible, most notably in 97 CE, when the Praetorian Guard, dissatisfied with his lack of military credentials and emboldened by their power in recent years, staged an open revolt demanding punishment of those responsible for Domitian's assassination. A moment that nearly toppled Nerva's reign and revealed how little real control he had over the army, for without the loyalty of the soldiers, no emperor could survive. To his credit, Nerva showed personal courage during this crisis, reportedly offering his own life to the guards to spare the Senate conspirators. But in reality, his position was untenable, and he had to concede by handing over several of Domitian's assassins to be executed. A humiliating compromise that weakened his authority further and underscored that the Roman throne was not secure without the backing of the military machine. However, this crisis also revealed Nerva's shrewdness, for instead of continuing to risk his rule in confrontations with the soldiers, he sought a permanent solution by adopting a successor who would not only legitimize his dynasty but also satisfy the army's demand for a strong, proven general. And this decision led to one of the most important acts of his reign, the adoption of Marcus Ulpius Traianus, better known as Trajan, a respected general stationed in Germania, who commanded immense loyalty from the legions and had already proven his administrative capabilities as governor, making him the ideal candidate to secure both Senate and military support. With this adoption, Nerva not only ensured the survival of his regime, but also laid the foundation for one of Rome's greatest dynasties, the so-called Five Good Emperors, whose combined reigns would bring nearly a century of stability and prosperity to the empire. But before that future glory could unfold, Nerva still had to manage the final months of his rule, a time marked by efforts to shore up finances, implement practical reforms, and prepare the state for Trajan's succession. His fiscal policies during this time reveal his pragmatic approach, for though he reduced burdensome taxes and gave relief to farmers, he was careful not to bankrupt the treasury, instead introducing more efficient means of tax collection and selling off imperial estates to raise revenue, an act that simultaneously diminished the aura of imperial excess and reinforced his reputation for moderation. He also enacted reforms that targeted social welfare, particularly for Italy's poor, through schemes such as the Alimenta, which provided financial assistance to the children of impoverished families, ensuring a future generation of citizens loyal to Rome. And though later emperors like Trajan and Hadrian would expand this program, Nerva deserves credit for laying its groundwork, showing that his policies were not merely reactive, but also forward-looking. In terms of foreign policy, Nerva's short reign left little room for military campaigns, but he recognized the importance of maintaining peace on the frontiers, especially along the Danube and in Germania, where tensions were high. And by entrusting Trajan with command, he not only pacified the legions, but also ensured that the empire's borders were defended by a capable leader, a decision that again demonstrates his political prudence. Culturally, Nerva promoted freedom of expression and intellectual life, allowing philosophers and writers to flourish without fear of persecution, a stark contrast to Domitian's censorship. And this intellectual renaissance contributed to the image of his reign as a moral renewal, even though his political authority remained fragile. All of these elements together show that Nerva's second year as emperor was not a period of decisive military conquest or vast construction, but rather one of careful statecraft, crisis management, and strategic foresight. For by acknowledging his own limitations and elevating Trajan, he effectively guaranteed the continuity of the empire beyond his own life, an act of humility and wisdom rare among emperors, many of whom clung to power or placed incompetent relatives on the throne. Historians later judged Nerva, kindly remembering him as the emperor who restored liberty after Domitian's tyranny and who ensured Rome's future by inaugurating the adoptive principle of succession, a system that would bring forth some of the most capable rulers in history. And though his reign was brief and marred by difficulties, it was precisely his ability to survive those difficulties and make pragmatic choices that gave Rome the stability it desperately needed during a vulnerable moment. In the end, the legacy of this second phase of Nerva's reign lies not in monuments or conquests, but in the quiet wisdom of an old man who knew that the empire's survival required compromise, humility, and above all the foresight to entrust its fate to stronger hands, thus ensuring that when he died in early 98 CE, Rome was not plunged into chaos, but instead entered into one of its golden ages under Trajan, a testament to Nerva's prudence and political acumen. When Nerva entered the later phase of his short but historically significant reign, the weight of his decisions became increasingly clear, for his ability to balance tradition and innovation, stability and reform, and reconciliation with assertion defined his role in bridging the uncertain years after Domitian's assassination and before the long and celebrated era of Trajan. By the time his government reached the middle point of its administration, the Roman people and the Senate looked to him not only as a peacemaker who had ended the immediate hostility of Domitian's brutal autocracy, but also as a ruler capable of ensuring the longevity of Rome's institutions. The immense challenge Nerva faced was that he had not built his power through military campaigns, nor had he ascended through the force of bloodline. Rather, his legitimacy rested entirely on the fragile balance of senatorial goodwill and the uneasy tolerance of the powerful legions who had for decades been loyal to the Flavian dynasty. In this way, Nerva had to tread a delicate path. He could neither ignore the Senate, who had effectively placed him on the throne as their candidate after Domitian's fall, nor could he disregard the military, who had little attachment to him personally, and whose commanders often wielded the true power in the provinces. This unique position forced him to craft a reign that was cautious, deliberate, and carefully calibrated to prevent the empire from splintering into another civil war such as the Year of the Four Emperors just 3 decades before. As Nerva progressed into the second year of his rule, he began focusing his attention on reform policies that would not only earn him respect as a benefactor of the Roman people, but also establish precedents that would outlast his reign, thereby strengthening his image as a transitional but honorable emperor. One of the most notable of these reforms was his fiscal generosity. Nerva initiated programs of land distributions and special funds for the poor, especially aiding orphan children, which highlighted his image as a paternal figure of the empire. Such policies harkened back to Augustus' emphasis on caring for the Roman populace, and they were shrewd political moves to anchor his regime in a tradition that both the Senate and people could respect. At the same time, these measures gave him the reputation of a compassionate ruler, softening the harsh memories of Domitian's tyrannical taxation and financial extortions. In addition to fiscal reforms, Nerva placed emphasis on restoring liberty to the Senate and lifting the suffocating atmosphere of fear that had dominated under Domitian. He reversed many of the oppressive edicts, recalled exiles, and allowed free speech in senatorial debates once again, thereby reviving the senatorial dignity that had been eroded by decades of emperors, who treated senators as little more than ceremonial advisors. This liberation of the Senate was not merely symbolic. It re-energized Rome's political life, even though the Senate remained subordinate to imperial authority. Nerva's actions demonstrated his deep understanding of the political necessity of reconciliation, for in presenting himself as a cooperative emperor who worked with senators rather than against them, he secured their loyalty and legitimacy. Yet for all of these efforts, the military situation remained a looming shadow over his reign. The Praetorian Guard and frontier legions were restless, having been accustomed to emperors who came from military backgrounds, and Nerva, an elderly senator with little martial charisma, seemed ill-suited to embody their ideal of leadership. In this phase of his reign, the tension between Nerva and the military escalated into one of the most dangerous crises of his government, the mutiny of the Praetorian Guard, who in late 97 CE stormed the imperial palace, took Nerva hostage, and demanded the execution of Domitian's assassins. This shocking event revealed the precariousness of Nerva's position, for although he had restored harmony to the Senate and popularity among the people, he lacked the physical means to command the loyalty of Rome's soldiers. The mutiny humiliated him publicly and underscored that without military support, an emperor's reign could collapse no matter how many senatorial decrees or public works he instituted. However, Nerva's remarkable resilience shone through even in this moment of disgrace. Rather than collapse under pressure or retaliate recklessly, he recognized the reality of his weakened position and made the crucial decision that would secure his legacy and stabilize Rome's future. Understanding that his lack of military credentials endangered the empire, Nerva adopted Marcus Ulpius Troianus, better known as Trajan, a rising general of enormous reputation, as his heir and successor. This adoption was both unprecedented and revolutionary, for Nerva was not related to Trajan by blood, but chose him solely on merit and strategic necessity. In doing so, he established a precedent that would become known as the adoptive principle, wherein emperors selected the most capable individual as their successor, rather than relying on hereditary ties alone. The choice of Trajan not only placated the military, who immediately recognized one of their own as the future emperor, but it also reassured the Senate and people that Rome would pass into the hands of a competent leader rather than descend into further uncertainty. Thus, in the third stage of his reign, Nerva achieved the most important decision of his career. The adoption of Trajan transformed his legacy from that of a weak, transitional figure into a wise ruler who saved Rome from potential collapse. With Trajan declared heir, the tension with the military subsided, and Nerva's remaining months were marked by a renewed sense of stability, as Rome could now look forward to a future under a strong leader. This decision alone ensured that Nerva would be remembered not only as the emperor who healed the wounds left by Domitian, but also as the man whose foresight paved the way for one of the most celebrated periods in Roman history, the era of the 5 good emperors. As Nerva grew increasingly frail in his final year, his governance became less active. But his earlier reforms and the security of succession meant that the empire remained peaceful, avoiding the calamities that so often followed the death of an emperor. His legacy was therefore not measured in conquests or monumental constructions, but in the subtle yet crucial art of political survival and wise succession planning. In this way, Nerva's later reign demonstrated how even an emperor with limited power, resources, and charisma could nonetheless alter the trajectory of Rome by making decisions rooted in prudence, humility, and foresight. Nerva's later years in power were not free from challenges, for even though he had managed to establish a degree of stability after the turbulence of the Flavian dynasty and the disastrous reign of Domitian, the empire still bore the scars of civil unrest, military dissatisfaction, and political uncertainty. One of the key aspects of Nerva's reign in its later phase was his recognition that his position as emperor was not as secure as it might have appeared in Rome. The Senate may have embraced him as a wise elder statesman who represented a return to senatorial influence after years of autocratic rule, but the legions were less easily convinced. The soldiers, particularly those stationed in the provinces along the Rhine and the Danube, were still deeply loyal to Domitian, despite his tyranny, because he had been generous with pay, cared for their welfare, and spent significant time dealing with frontier defense. This loyalty did not vanish with Domitian's assassination, and Nerva soon realized that the army viewed him as a weak and overly senatorial emperor, a man chosen by elites in Rome rather than by the gods or by military might. This realization shaped much of the fourth phase of his reign, when he sought to solidify his legacy and protect the empire from slipping into chaos. The Praetorian Guard, who had been instrumental in the assassination of Domitian, now found themselves torn between their desire for influence and the dissatisfaction spreading among the legions. At one point, in 97 AD, the Guard turned against Nerva himself, pressuring him in an open revolt to hand over those responsible for Domitian's death. Nerva, old and frail, was powerless in the face of the Guard's fury, and he was forced to give up Petronius Secundus, the Praetorian prefect, and Parthenius, Domitian's chamberlain, both of whom were executed. This humiliating event exposed just how little control Nerva truly had over the forces that had helped bring him to power. The Senate could pass decrees in his favor, and Rome's elite could flatter him as a wise leader. But the empire's real backbone was the military, and without their loyalty, no emperor could survive. Nerva knew that he had to act quickly to restore balance, or his reign would collapse into another civil war like the year of the 4 emperors, just 3 decades earlier. It was in this moment of crisis that Nerva made perhaps the most important decision of his reign, one that would shape not just his legacy, but the entire future of the Roman Empire for nearly a century. He adopted as his heir Marcus Ulpius Troianus, known to history simply as Trajan. Trajan was a seasoned general, a man of proven ability who was widely respected by the legions for his courage, discipline, and leadership on the frontier. Unlike Nerva, who had never been a soldier, Trajan had spent much of his life commanding troops along the Rhine and Danube, and his reputation as a soldier made him the perfect candidate to win back the loyalty of the army. Nerva's adoption of Trajan in late 97 AD, not just a symbolic gesture. It was a masterstroke of political strategy. By naming Trajan as his heir, Nerva ensured that the succession would be smooth, that the army would rally behind a strong leader, and that Rome would avoid another destructive civil war. This move also marked the beginning of what later historians would call the era of the 5 good emperors, a period of stability, prosperity, and relative peace that would last until the death of Marcus Aurelius nearly a century later. Nerva's wisdom lay in recognizing his own limitations and understanding that he could not personally provide what the empire most needed, military strength. Instead, he ensured that the next emperor would embody those qualities, thereby securing the survival of the empire and his own reputation as a wise and selfless ruler. The decision to adopt Trajan had immediate and profound effects on the political climate of Rome. The Senate, though initially wary of Trajan because of his military background, accepted him with relief, seeing in him a figure who could bridge the gap between civilian governance and military power. The people of Rome, weary of tyranny, but also fearful of instability, welcomed the news that a capable and popular general would succeed Nerva. Most importantly, the legions, who had grown increasingly restless, found in Trajan a leader they could respect, and this quelled much of the dissatisfaction that had threatened to undermine Nerva's reign. From this point forward, Nerva was able to govern with greater confidence, not because his own authority had grown stronger, but because the looming question of succession had been resolved in a way that satisfied both the army and the Senate. The empire, for the first time in decades, could look forward with a sense of security. This was no small achievement, and it is one of the reasons Nerva is remembered not as a failure, but as a pivotal transitional figure in Roman history. His reign may have been short and fraught with challenges, but by choosing Trajan, he laid the foundation for Rome's golden age. The final months of Nerva's reign were marked by a quiet dignity. He continued to focus on policies that reflected his desire to be remembered as a just and benevolent emperor. He extended land distribution programs, provided additional funds for the maintenance of roads and aqueducts, and introduced measures to help children from impoverished families, ensuring they received food and basic care. These actions, though modest compared to the grand projects of emperors like Augustus or the Flavians, left a lasting impression on the Roman people, who saw in Nerva an emperor who genuinely cared for their welfare. Unlike Domitian, who had built massive monuments to glorify himself, Nerva's legacy was not etched in stone, but in the lives of ordinary Romans who benefited from his generosity. This contrast between his humility and Domitian's arrogance further endeared him to the Senate, who would later honor him with deification after his death. Yet, for all his achievements, Nerva's health was declining rapidly. He was already in his 60s when he became emperor, an advanced age by Roman standards, and the stresses of ruling the empire had taken their toll. By January of 98 A, it was clear that Nerva's life was nearing its end. He died peacefully on the 27th of that month, after a reign of just 16 months, leaving behind a legacy far greater than the brevity of his rule might suggest. Nerva's death marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. With Trajan as his successor, Rome was poised to enter an era of unparalleled expansion and prosperity. Yet it is important to recognize that this was only possible because of Nerva's foresight and humility. He was not a conqueror, nor a great builder, nor a charismatic visionary. Instead, he was a man who understood the moment in which he lived and made the right decision at the right time. In this sense, his reign can be seen as a bridge between the instability of the first century and the stability of the second. Later historians, such as Edward Gibbon, would look back on the period beginning with Nerva and extending through Marcus Aurelius as the height of Roman civilization, an age when the empire was governed by reason, justice, and wisdom. Nerva, though often overshadowed by the emperors who came after him, deserves recognition as the man who set this golden age in motion. His reign may have been brief, but its impact was profound. Nerva's legacy is perhaps one of the most understated yet important in the grand arc of Roman imperial history. For while his reign lasted just 16 months from September 96 to January 98 AD, the decisions he made, the policies he enacted, and the stability he carefully nurtured became the foundation of one of the greatest periods in Roman governance. Often referred to as the era of the 5 good emperors, and to fully appreciate the final stage of Nerva's life and reign, one must understand both the challenges he faced in his last months and the consequences of his most momentous decision, the adoption of Marcus Ulpius Traianus, known to history as Trajan, a general of great popularity and immense military skill, whose elevation would shape the next century of the Roman Empire. But before exploring that monumental act, let us reflect on the context of Nerva's rule in its closing days. For the emperor, who began as an elderly senator, thrust unexpectedly into power following Domitian's assassination, now stood as a ruler caught between the demands of the Senate, who had placed their faith in him to restore dignity after tyranny, and the army, who still revered Domitian and distrusted the frail, scholarly figure who had never commanded troops in the field. And as the year 97 dawned, this tension reached a boiling point when members of the Praetorian Guard, outraged by the execution of their fellow guardsmen who had conspired in Domitian's assassination, stormed the imperial palace, seizing Nerva and holding him hostage in what would become one of the most humiliating moments for any Roman emperor. For here was the supreme ruler of the Roman world forced to submit powerless as his guards demanded vengeance and the execution of Domitian's killers, and though Nerva attempted to resist, the pressure was overwhelming, and ultimately, he conceded, handing over the conspirators, including his close advisor Casperius Alinus, who were put to death by the enraged guards. And though Nerva survived the incident, his authority was shattered, his image of dignity tarnished, and his position precarious for the army had made it clear that his rule rested on fragile ground, a truth Nerva recognized with clarity, and it was at this moment, in one of the most crucial decisions of Roman history, that he chose to adopt a man who could bring the loyalty of the army firmly back to the throne. And that man was Trajan, the governor of Upper Germany, a soldier of remarkable discipline, competence, and popularity among the legions, for, by naming Trajan as his son and heir, Nerva effectively acknowledged his own limitations and ensured a seamless transition that would prevent civil war, calm the army, and satisfy the Senate, who respected Trajan's reputation for fairness and moderation. And so, in October of 97 AD, the adoption was formally declared, with Nerva bestowing upon Trajan the title of Caesar and granting him tribunician power, making him co-ruler in practice and undisputed successor in name. And this act, far more than any coin reform, senatorial decree, or legal change, became the defining legacy of Nerva's reign. For in that single decision, he bound the Senate and army in unity, set the precedent for the peaceful adoption of capable heirs, rather than reliance on bloodline or assassination, and laid the cornerstone of the golden age of Rome that followed as Trajan and later Hadrian Antoninus Pius Marcus Aurelius and even Lucius Verus would guide the empire to its peak of stability and prosperity, but to return to Nerva himself. The months after Trajan's adoption were calmer with the emperor, enjoying a brief resurgence of authority, issuing decrees that reinforced his vision of a just and moderate ruler, including measures to protect tenants from abusive landlords, to further support impoverished children through alimenta schemes, and to reduce unnecessary prosecutions under laws of treason. A deliberate reversal of Domitian's reign of fear. And these policies, though small in scope, reflected Nerva's enduring image as a man of fairness, prudence, and balance. But age and frailty continued to weigh heavily upon him, and in January 98, while in the gardens of Sallust in Rome, Nerva fell ill and died of natural causes at the age of 67, leaving behind a Rome at peace, a Senate restored to dignity, and a successor who would become one of the greatest emperors in history. And upon his death, the Senate swiftly deified him and honor granted, not merely for his reign itself, which was brief and fraught with difficulty, but for his foresight in securing the future of the empire through Trajan. And so Nerva, who had been seen by some as a placeholder, a transitional figure too weak to command and too old to reform, became immortalized as the emperor who had saved Rome from chaos, bridging the gap between the dark tyranny of Domitian and the luminous era of the 5 good emperors. And when historians like Edward Gibbon centuries later reflected on Rome's greatest age, it was Nerva they acknowledged as the pivot upon which fortune turned. For without his wisdom to adopt Trajan, the empire might have collapsed into factional strife, its armies divided, its senate powerless, and its provinces rebellious. Yet because of his decision, Rome not only survived, but flourished. And thus Nerva's final chapter stands as a lesson in humility, prudence, and statesmanship, proving that sometimes greatness lies not in conquest or glory, but in the wisdom to step aside, to recognize one's own limits, and to ensure the future by choosing the right successor. And so the story of Nerva ends, not with the thunder of triumph or the drama of betrayal, but with the quiet dignity of an old man who, in his short reign, safeguarded the greatest empire the world had yet seen, leaving a legacy that would endure long after his name faded from popular memory. And in this sense, his reign, though often overlooked, was indispensable, for it was the hinge upon which the door of Rome's golden age swung open, a door that would remain open for nearly a century, thanks to the wisdom of a man who ruled briefly but decisively, proving that sometimes the smallest reigns cast the longest shadows across history.